Okay, all of you can see. So, okay, sorry. This is kind of a quote, and it's a little bit pessimistic to start with, but it's a quote from a document, a recent one by England's Museums Network, which has been a lot of local government and local authorities in England who own or have authority over museums. And they're kind of promoting the idea of a museum as a civic space, and how can we redefine this kind of cultural space as a civic space. And this is what they say, in that they say kind of the state of the 21st century, and they start like that in the UK we are wealthier and longer longer lived than we have ever been, yet we are more unhappy. There are increasing levels of self-inflicted disease, loneliness, poor mental health, suicide and disaffection. And it goes on for 2 paragraphs, kind of doom and gloom. But then the rest of it is a bit more, okay, we need a new enlightenment where we can live in a healthier, happier era. And they really focus on participation, belonging, innovation, and kind of social networks. Which, sorry, this is now over my, sorry, I can't see what I've written. Can't see my scroll anyway. Okay, whatever. Okay, so the kind of current cultural and social content, and some of those, the reason for some of those, they kind of go on to say it's this notion of neo-individualism, which is an extreme sense of individualism to a point that you feel that it's so much about you without anybody else, and you don't need anybody else, and it's just you can make it all happen. That actually has led to some of these issues of isolation, decades of neglect and no investment in social and community infrastructure, short-term thinking. Again, that report and some of the other reports from Royal Society of Arts and so on are really promoting long-term thinking, which is just not what's happening in government and in institutions. Focusing on social wealth focusing on financial wealth rather than any other form of wealth. Privatization, disempowerment of local government, and socialization, which I talk about a little bit later, which is a sociology, terminology, and concept about how we get educated into how we build our value systems as a society. Okay, so and I'm not saying this is the only way that we can kind of think about these new mechanisms of operation towards this I mean, towards, I don't want to call it an enlightenment, but in a way, the commons has been coined by not me, but by many scholars and practitioners of the commons as a post-capitalist kind of solution to deal with some of those issues that I kind of raised and that other people are raising. So there is no unified definition about it, especially in terms of contemporary commons, and every scholar or thinker has a different way to describe it, which I think is absolutely fine. I don't think we need a unified definition. It is in its core about empowerment and agency, building solidarity in social relationships and networks. Clear democratic models for governance structures and practice models. Commons also, you have borders for the way that Eleanor Ostrom talked about, that you have boundaries to commons. And so the design of how you design those borders and boundaries is part of the design process. It also, in its infancy right now, it requires development of new imaginaries. So that's again where the role of artists, architects, cultural practitioners comes in really clearly. It celebrates complexity, restructures forms of power. It's in opposition to the neoliberal market structures. It's about identification and protection of our resources, whether they're scarce or precious. It prioritizes being cooperative and collaborative than competitive. It's embedded in long-term thinking. It looks at a more holistic forms of capital, which is social, which is all our social relationships; human, which is about our education and training; financial, we know; natural, which is our ecology; and cultural, which is our cultural capital. So it can be applied to many disciplines, and it has kind of an economy for common good financial system, which is not about money is a means for you to kind of achieve what it is that you need to achieve in terms of this kind of well-being. It is well, some people call it a movement, some people don't, but this is where I became quite familiar with it at the European Commons Assembly in the European Parliament in Brussels, where there were people who were researching and practicing commons, and there were about over 500 organizations. So I really started to understand that it is something really quite important and emerging. This is just kind of a slide which is really about the role of design in all of those kind of facets that I just explained in terms of the commons. So designing of creative and playful platforms for engagement and that social solidarity building, designing democratic models of governance, designing physical and social and political boundaries and borders, visual new imaginaries, ecosystems of learning and ecology, mapping and designing structures of power, which is another thing which the commons start to put on their heads in terms of who has power, and allowing power to flow rather than be dominated by the few. So anyway, so these are kind of, is more like a comprehensive slide of, well, not comprehensive, but it's kind of a slide of some of the design elements that we've been involved in, both through the masters and through our practice. So now objects. Objects are all around us. They basically are what constructs our cultural understanding of the world that we live in. And you have, and I'm not showing really the non-material culture aspect of it. I'm just focusing on that because it's a huge, huge topic. And it kind of goes from cultural practice, cultural theory to philosophy, sociology, anthropology. So it's a massive, massive topic. So I'm just going to really summarize a little bit to make it a bit more digestible. So I really need to move myself. Why can't I see this? Sorry. Anyway. Okay, so there's the material culture. It's what you're probably all involved in. They play a role in how we experience the world, and how we actually give meaning and agency to the world as well. They hold memories. They are about they kind of support experiences of agency and how we relate to each other, and how we relate, how we create actually communities of interest, and so on and so forth. So they're actually really, really important. And maybe there might be some of you who are from different disciplines. So when I'm talking about objects, maybe just at the back of your mind, think about the objects that you're involved in within your practices as I'm talking, and see where some of these things kind of sit within that. So they also kind of start to construct values, which I'll talk about in a minute. This is a diagram I did for this talk. And I don't know if you can see, but it's kind of it's one way of defining cultural commons, the way that I see it more as a macro level of cultural commons. There can be different scales of it, but the object is essential in all of these things that I'm going to explain in a minute. I've also, in my research, I've also very much embedded it geographically in terms of a town or a neighborhood, approximately 20 to 30,000 people. Now, what a lot of theoreticians or in reports and so on they're talking about is that in this kind of neoliberal period in the last 40 to 50 years, maybe even longer, a lot of our institutions that kind of created our collective identity have been eroded, be it the church or the town hall or any kind of civic infrastructure that actually dealt with collective identity. And so what has happened with this neo-individualism is that we all have very plural interests. And what happens that you create your little bubbles of interest, and in their best is that you can join different in-groups and be part of different interest groups. At worst, it can be that you just become an internalized bubble, and it can kind of recreate values, the same values over and over again, and it kind of can create extremism. So there are kind of these things which are happening. And so there is a real need in terms of how do we, in this plural, diverse culture that we live in today because of globalization and multiculturalism, how do we create a collective identity thinking about plurality? And so in this, I kind of have all these circles that, you can think about that. How do you start to create that within the scale of a neighborhood? And then as you see those little cells, looks like a COVID kind of virus. But as you see in these other cells is that when they start to then be you can then, once you've created it quite holistically and cooperatively at the scale of one neighborhood, then it's not that then you start to compete with another neighborhood, but that actually there is a cooperativism and collaboration between neighborhoods to a point that you kind of start to have a commons trust and a larger kind of system of a cultural commons. Now, there are different, I talk about different fields within the cultural commons. One which is around the practice. So whether that's, and I mean, in a way that can either be disciplinary or it can be interdisciplinary. I probably would advocate interdisciplinary. And I'm just gonna, because I can't read it on there. So yeah, so that's in that one. In the practice, it's really about what you promote in terms of ethics, in terms of social relationship, in terms of those values of how we operate as social beings together with the cultural objects. The next one is events. So which is that orangey one. Events is basically where you start to not just mobilize a bigger collective and a community, but you also start to understand what those values are and and understand the plurality of those values and how they might come together. And it might be the event that actually brings that plurality together, and it's not like a very singular idea of what that identity is. So maybe events become a really important mechanism for that kind of collective identity to be played out in the public realm. Then there is the objects, and these are not really like, well, they might be the layers, the sequence, but anyway, that needs to be explored further. But then there are the objects and spaces and land, the physical stuff. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this lecture. I'm not going to talk about the rest, but I wanted you just to have the overview of the whole thing. And then there is ownership and authorship models, which are models of power. And so one has to then really start to think about what those models are and how they can become part of an empowerment and agency giving agenda. Then there is, of course, a financing element, so that it has to be resourced, so that all of this can actually be resourced for not for profit necessarily, but for it to sustain itself and operate. Where the neighborhood and the public sector interact, and that's another whole lecture, are what could be seen as civic commons, which are where the civil society and the state come together in collaboration to deliver public good and to deliver common good, rather than what we have right now is the markets and the private sector and the public sector. And so this is kind of just, and those kind of black blobs are other social and cultural institutions that kind of support that whole organism and system. That's why I wanted to kind of it to look like an organism in a way. Yesterday you had biomimicry, so maybe that's also helpful in some way. So anyway, so that's kind of the macro scale, just to kind of position it within that. Okay, now we go into the objects. The system of objects, it's really, it was coined by the French philosopher called Baudrillard. And it was in 1968. And in a nutshell, it was very much about the fact that the objects that are in our lives are all part of a social, political, economic system. And for us to understand the object, its agency and its role, we need to understand it in relation to that bigger system. And so, and he talks about it from even separating the, not always looking at the base level of the object. So it's not just about its functionality, but it has all sorts of other values. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Oh, this thing is in front. Okay. So these are, so he kind of was really quite critical on this notion of the object as a source of consumption, rather than thinking about it in terms of production. Because the moment that it's part of consumption, it just breeds that kind of system, which becomes quite extractive and about surplus production. Now, I think it's really important to also understand the system of consumption. We have to kind of be careful not to have these bad and good kind of dichotomies. So consumption in an economic level has been really, really important in driving society out of poverty. But it's again the design of what kind of consumption and what kind of trade and what kind of exchanges do we do, which maybe isn't just about more and more stuff being put out there. And that for me is very much also to do with buildings. And what he describes, he describes three categories, which I found really interesting also as a trained architect, that there are material objects, such as stuff, products, objects. There are abstract objects, which are more like characters, and then experiential objects, which are like performances or things which are used in performances and events. That I just talked about the fact that it's really important to see the objects that we put into the world in terms of their diverse meaning and values. And that he also talked about the fact that they are created through conflict and opposition, which I'll talk about a bit later when I talk about the disobedient object. and then and that you have to be quite careful about the relationship between the objects and the images of the objects and the words that describe them. So there's kind of quite a lot of rigor in terms of just looking at the object, because each one of those starts to give a certain value to that object, which if you as a designer are not in control of what the intentionality of it is, then it gets co-opted and used in very different ways. So that it is, I mean, yeah, it's a massive thing with signs and signifiers, but they're always signs of something else. And I'll talk about that maybe a bit later. So, and so he also talked about, yeah, so Marx talks about use value, the importance of use value, and Baudrillard was quite, although a lot of his writing was influenced by Marx, he was also a little bit critical of the simplicity of use value, because it implies that things are needed. But what he says is that in a capitalist or a neoliberal capitalist society, the need is artificially constructed, and it's more about desire than need, and that happens through advertising. So actually, so just to think about it from use value is quite limiting. Yeah, so I think it's also quite important that they always signify something socially. And that, you know, that could be status, or it could be, you know, other kind of social stigmas that go with those particular objects. Again, that comes later. That it's also about their users. And that's why he thinks consumption, because of the fact that they operate as signs, that, you know, if you have a really plush, for example, I'll turn it into architecture, but if you have a really kind of a particular design aesthetic, it is a certain sign for a certain social status, as opposed to something else. So he says that it is always subject. Whatever that thing looks like is always subject, and you have to be in a way in control of that. So he also talks about that the objects are creating values, and if you're not in control of that value, you probably end up doing exactly what you intended not to do. And I'll give you one really quick example as an architect. Was that I did this project for an artist. It was a refurbishment, and we had all these really fantastic ideas about hosting and the social relationship of the home as a civic space and all of that. But actually the visual aesthetic was high design, but it wasn't very expensive, but it was that. And then when it was evaluated by the estate agents, I had doubled the price of that house. And so it kind of started, and it was in a social housing complex, so it started to in a way I gentrified it. So somehow and until later I wasn't even aware of it, and you know, you can't be aware of everything, but it is quite important to be aware of the values that you're making and whether it is your intention to do that. So one, he talks about the functional value of the object, and so how it is as an instrument. That I can't read bits of my text, but you guys can read it. So there is a functional value. Then there is the exchange value, which is what you exchange it for, and that becomes a different value. And in a capitalist system, we predominantly focus on the exchange value as a success, and as you know, how much you sell it for, or how much you get paid for actually delivering it. Then there is the symbolic value, and that is something that you can't really control it. Society assigns that value onto it, and that, well, in a way, it's through advertising, it's through social relationships. So it's more, symbolism happens when it's embedded within the community. You can't create symbols. Symbols have to become part of social practice, and over that time and in ritual they become symbols. So, you know, for example, a cross is a symbol, but it's been through practice. And then there is the sign value of the object, and that is more about the object and the status, the taste, the class. And it doesn't mean that these things are wrong. It means that if you're aware of it and you understand it, then you design it intentionally for what you need it to do. So I'm not going to show this YouTube, but you will have this, and you will have this presentation anyway. But socialization is a terminology within sociology, which is that we are the products of all our experiences ever since we were one, basically. So all of those values build up to who we are and what our tastes are, what our values are, what we believe in, what we don't believe in, and all of that. And so, and that has unlocked quite a lot for me, because especially teaching architecture, you know, you have lots of people with different cultures, but, you know, there is a kind of system of taste that somehow I was, you know, I had to go through and be socialized to that regime, and it's kind of backed up by, you know, the media within design disciplines, or within whatever it might be. The school is part of it, your community is part of it, your parents are part of it. So all of this, what you see in the environment, all of this kind of constructs a kind of socialization process. And that's why aesthetic is very difficult to it's very subjective, because whenever you see something, whether you like it or not, don't like it, is very much subject to everything that you've been socialized to value. So that's why it is a very difficult thing to put your finger on. So talking about that, it's how also one interpreting objects is part of the aesthetic process of how you see aesthetic. So, and I think that's where I think allowing plurality of aesthetics to exist is really, really important. But, you know, we're not wired in this system to have that, you know, that we have been socialized in what is good taste, or a good system of visual, whatever you call it. But anyway, this kind of interpreting of objects is it's in cultural discourse. It's huge. So don't start getting bogged down in it. But I just do a summary of it. So persons inhabit, this is Lynn Rudder Baker. She writes quite a lot around artifacts and their interpretation. So persons inhabit what I'll call the world of encounter, the world in which we engage our friends, family, and colleagues, the world that all human persons interact with. The items that we encounter every day are things whose existence we cannot in good faith deny. Our homes, you know, the built environment, these are not things, they're part of our everyday life, and they're part of how we get socialized. So I think that's really interesting. And objects become part of that. It's a part of how we build our identity, how we build collective identity, and how we build our reality in a way. Good God, I hope, okay, let's go through these with me seeing only half of the text.
So do you need help moving this thing?
Yeah, maybe. I just can't see my cursor, so it kind of goes on things, but I can't, it would help. Sorry, guys. It kind of just flickers everywhere. Ah, you see, I can't see it. Ah, well done. Yeah, on that side, it doesn't matter. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so um, so we are, as I said earlier about aesthetic, we are interpreters of reality, which is experienced in our everyday life. So it's very localized. It's situated. Um, it isn't abstract. So I think there's a bit of kind of feminist discourse comes into this in terms of situatedness and localism. Um, um, Interpretation is also a linguistic affair, and this is also really interesting in terms of how you describe something. So being quite careful about the description, but also storytelling, using objects to visualize and ground narratives, is really interesting. I think that with all of this, you have to be aware that these have been systems of actually dominance by dominant power for a long time. And I think power relations and being very careful that you're not becoming autocratic in these systems is really, really important to always test your where power is being exerted or flown. So that kind of the linguistic side of how objects are described, a lot of theorists and philosophers kind of talk about the fact that the moment you might even talk about an object, and by talking and describing it, you're already making the object. So I think in that sense that don't underestimate the power of the linguistic. Also in the values of seeing, which in turn has an impact on the aesthetic. It is subjective. And so, but however, yeah, I mean, there's a lot around that, but it's too much for now. So this is Baker Still, she talks about that there are three features. There's the context of the object, so you need to understand the context. There is a prior description, so that's something you're actually familiar with. And then there is a redescription, and I think as architects we do quite a lot of redescription because we're propositional. And whereas in anthropology, for example, you have a lot of prior description. You don't re-describe in a way in that sense. It's they kind of look at the current description. But I think in that sense, it's quite important to look at the power of who describes and who redescribes, and who's involved in those processes. Yeah, so what she talks about is that in the process of interpretation is not about creating new objects, but new ways of looking at given objects. I talked about this earlier as well, about that it's also, this interpretation is also about how we relate to each other and understand each other's values. So actually using objects as a way to, as a conversation piece, or as a way to kind of dialogue, is part of that cultural practice, which I think is really interesting, about value building and needs and so on. Yeah, and also I think that becomes a way to check that we are not imposing a kind of culture of taste through allowing allowing dialogue being part of the interpretation. So that I think is maybe quite interesting in how we should restructure how we talk about our projects, more in dialogue than maybe in more power, structures of power related settings. So yeah, that's the idea of plural taste. And they always, I suppose, when you redescribe, they also build new realities, which requires these propositional attitudes. And that, again, I think is quite interesting in, I suppose I teach it in Design for Cultural Commons because I've come from architecture. And I think it is that world where, because we're propositional as designers, it's not just architects, as designers, you're propositional, and you're proposing new realities into the world, into the reality of the world. And that's where I think it's really important to be critical about what it is that you're putting into that world. Intention is really important. And we talk about that quite a lot, actually, in our course, because intention at every level, what the intention is in terms of the governance of a practice, in terms of how you act, in terms of how you make, in terms of what you make it out of, all of that, there is an intention of the maker, which Levine, a philosopher on making and events, talks about in terms of the intention of the maker or the designer is the first thing to kind of consider, because if your intention is to make as much money as possible, then that is a very different meaning or value that you're giving to an object than if the intention is something else. So that intention is really important. And then she talks about that there are relations between the intentional people making the things that becomes part of the reality of our everyday lives, and the conditions of the socialization, which is what I've just said, what you're putting into the world. And I know this all sounds like, oh my God, I just don't want to make anything, which is probably why anthropologists don't. But that's not the case. I think it's more to become more critical and more aware about what it is that you put into the world, and it is part of a learning process, and through that kind of reflective critical thinking, you kind of then start to think, okay, if that hasn't quite happened, how do I pull it out of that system and reinvent it into another system? So I don't think you need to worry not to kind of do that, but it's more about having this circular, reflective, iterative process where you can act at every level. Oh, why is this now not going? Okay. So again, now, because I'm presenting to an architecture school, I wanted to just pull it into the world of architecture for a moment. So when all of that I've been talking about, the object, in public works, because we've operated with so many different scales of objects. I mean, we've never operated at that scale, this scale that I'm showing, but because we've operated at different scales, I've seen that actually all of that thinking around the object actually is applicable to every scale. It just becomes more and more complex the bigger the object becomes. But I think the really important thing is to think, where is intention and success when you are conceiving an object? So even in these two images, where the success is and where the intention is, I think are very, very different. So again, I don't want to kind of say that every piece of architecture does something which has a singular position. The commercial piece of architecture, its success has very different values to do with efficiency, economics, height, for more space. There are very kind of clear agendas of where the success is, whereas the other project is about reuse, it's about atmosphere, it's about material. It's a very different kind of notion of success. So I think that's really important when you're thinking about the object that you're putting into the world. Where is its success, and is that part of your intention for what you think should go into the world, and create those new realities. So now, disobedient objects. This a lot of this is really from an exhibition that was done by curators Catherine Flood and Gavin Grindon, called The Disobedient Object at the V&A. I absolutely love their catalogue, and I'm sorry to say that you can't really get it. But so I've just summarized a few bits in here, and I think what this says is really about a different kind of articulation of the object, which I don't think is so talked about within kind of even, well, maybe product design. I don't know, I'm not in that world as much, but I think not so much in the architecture world. So this is a quote from them. So while disobedient objects are often appropriated, they also often appropriate their context of existing architectural situations, unlocking them to reframe a situation or produce new relationships. So what they talk about in terms of the disobedient object is that they are appropriated within the situation and the context, and so sometimes they exist, so we tap into them. Sometimes we're bringing them in, but they reframe the relationships, whether those are relationships of power or whatever relationships they are. And they, because they're in the museum context, they always talk about the history in the museums being from the top. So here, history from below entails multiplicity and interweaving of different historical moments, rather than one singular kind of clear moment, which is why I talk about this kind of plural collective identity within the cultural commons than kind of this dominant top-down imposition. This does not mean I think every disobedient object is a mobile bike, by the way. It's just an image. And so within this, we have to be aware of that activism also doesn't, it's a bit fashionable, that it doesn't become fetishized. One way is to assess its impact value, and also its resistive value. So what Baudrillard didn't talk about was impact value, which I'm going to credit my student Alice Holloway this year, and I absolutely loved it, that she said we need to think about impact value, and I kind of wholeheartedly think that's fantastic. Impact value of an object. So what kind of impact does it have at one point? And so a lot of what Gavin and Catherine talk about is, because in museums it's always the reverence of the crafted object. They talk against that quite a bit, but I thought, but there are moments where they or other artists talk about the importance of the crafted object. So there is one artist, and unfortunately I can't remember her name, I should have put it in here, but she talks about the beauty of craft is that at first it can seduce its audience. People are drawn in by the sheer skill and time taken to create a piece. This allows a dialogue to open up where the viewer can be challenged both emotionally and intellectually. It's the game of allure of the familiar, and the intriguing and the curious, and the attack of the unfamiliar. Whereas if you just push really unfamiliar, conflicting stuff at people, you will just get complete resistance, because people are quite fearful of unfamiliarity. So you have to kind of negotiate and play this game of familiar and unfamiliar in a way as a dialogue with objects and yourself to create new dialogues and to create new relationships. So disobedient objects institute new laws and new social organizations. And if they don't play this role, then they're not really disobedient objects. Then they're there in order to make a change and in order to create new kind of relationships of power or organizations or laws or whatever it might be. So they don't just become disobedient by you calling them that, although I know I talked about description and narrative, but that becomes, that's quite problematic because that goes into the world of kind of advertising and coercion. So one has to be quite careful with those. These objects don't move within the circles of commodity. So where for surplus financial profit-making financial values are generated. That doesn't mean that they could not have profit. It means that the profit gets put back into making kind of those social changes and structural changes, so that the disobedient object and activism start to operate together. So this is again Catherine and Gavin talking about cultural arenas as museums, telling stories from the above, and that's where how dominant power has been achieving kind of dominance, such as colonialism. And they also talk about the danger of these kind of linear narratives supporting that dominant status quo. So the disobedient object, they say, have hidden meanings that allow us to imagine how things could be otherwise. So again, about creating new imaginaries, telling the stories from below, celebrating fragmentation with coherence so that they don't just become completely ununderstandable. Also that high craft should not only be enjoyed by the privileged and for the private consumption, but how do we bring that, make that more democratic? I mean, that is something that the Bauhaus in Germany kind of talked about quite a lot, and that's why they wanted industrialization to be a way to bring craft, high craft and high art for everybody. However, that again, you see, if you don't consider the whole holistic system within which you're fighting for things, then it's what we have today in terms of like hyper prefabrication, fabrication and factory production. So disobedient objects can range from crafted ones to DIY ones. It is their impact for change that matters. Their story of success is really understood within the impact value that they have and the impact and the change they make. So the success of the disobedient object is not complying with the dominant logic and power necessarily. The dominant power can be the elitist establishment, whatever you decide in terms of the intention of your project is that. So whether it's the architecture establishment or the markets or cultural institutions or whatever it might be. And that identification is again part of your judgment. The first question needs to be, does this political object work in terms of the function for which it is created? And how does it have a political use or reuse? So what I want to say is that it's not so much that these have to be aggressive in any way. And I talk about that in a minute. There are two different forms of power. One which is called an effective form of resistance, not power, sorry, two different forms of resistive power. One which is called effective, which is more about, it's big, like rebellion, big movements, and so on. The other one is called episodic, which is more it's more covert, stealth, and slowly and incrementally creates change towards a kind of more dominant, resisting a kind of dominant power. So so it doesn't have to, they don't have to be kind of anything aggressive. They work within ecologies of other objects, and yeah, and they're in a way they're trying to test or exert counterpower. And they're also objects which have tactics and strategies. They are contingent and always evolving. And again, that's kind of something I was talking about earlier, that although you can really consider all of the stuff that I've just been outlining, you don't have to be afraid to put them out there, because they are always evolving and contingent, and you have to kind of, in a way, look at the systems or the practices within which it allows you to do that evolution. So they talk about all that is required is many small Promethean disobediences, at once clever, well thought out, and patiently pursued, so subtle at times as to avoid punishment entirely. Yeah, so it's kind of the more episodic resistive forms that I was just talking about. History is inevitably a matter of selective inclusion. Arenas such as museums turn political objects into cultural capital. There is real creativity in the making in social movements, yet material culture of social movements is rather untold. I think the really exciting and interesting thing with all this is that actually museums, especially kind of all this movement towards museums as civic spaces, are starting to look at this. So that becomes quite an interesting kind of research that at least I'm hoping that with the course we'll be looking at with the Tate Modern, around this kind of idea of museum as a commons. So this is still, this was the exhibition at the V&A, and this is still from what Catherine and Gavin talk about, that disobedient objects negotiated spaces of, they negotiate spaces of protest. And I quite enjoy this notion of negotiation, and the role of the designer as a negotiator and a facilitator. And so how one sees that, I mean, of course, when you read theory, they're always quite abstract, no? So, but I think what I find really interesting about these things is that, I have these sentences sometimes on my pieces of work to kind of use as a way to interrogate certain projects or certain models of action. And that ranges not just in kind of spatial projects, but or cultural projects, but also in terms of how one might design a learning program or a master's or things like that. Their making is intertwined to making of forgotten histories and struggles. And these 4 points I really, really like, that there is a logic to the disobedient object. One, indirect action that involves blocking or slowing down of power. Speaking out, how the message is disseminated and put out there, but who also speaks out. Making worlds, physical infrastructure of social movement, new ways of relating and living. But I think for me, that's also a lot to do with creating new imaginaries. Solidarity, that's a lot through, again, what I was talking about earlier, through events. And there where objects can support human relationships to also to come together or happen. And I think this is probably the last slide. That each movement has its own aesthetic composition. They can be symbolic and monumental, or small and domestic, mostly playful and humorous, simultaneously traumatic, antagonized and full of conflict. And I just wanted to leave with that because, in a way, what I'm really interested in and why I designed the course really was because I was really intrigued to see if the commons and the cultural commons is a movement, then what is its aesthetic composition? And it's something that we kind of, I don't know. I can, you know, hopefully it's plural, and hopefully every student over time can develop that, and over time even come back to us and kind of share that, and we kind of hash it back and forth. But I think that kind of idea of what is an aesthetic or the object within the system of commons is an open-ended research question that I'm putting out there. I think that's it. Yeah, that's it.